The Soviets' sudden affection for Quavim was not accident, but had been carefully solicited by Quavim himself. Even before coming to power, Quavim had met in secret with members of the Russian Commission visiting Iran, and assured them that, had he been the Prime Minister, he would have complied with all the suggestions of the Soviet Union. He knew that the Soviet threats and their intentionally provocative act of occasionally moving their forces near the Iranian border had cowed and frightened many members of the Majlis, and he publicized his intention to appease the Soviet Union if he became Prime Minister. To lessen America's objection to a Russian concession, Quavim promised American officials that if any arrangements were made with the Soviet Union, he would see that America was given some rights for exploration of oil in Baluchistan. In other words, Quavim's plans were in reality to give the Russians all they wanted. He would balance the Russian concession by giving American companies a stake in Iran's oil. The American ambassador ended his report by concluding that it was now up to the Shah to dissuade Quavim from making the ominous deal with the Soviet Union. But the Shah was never in favor of appeasing the Soviets, and by the time of Quavim's new tenure as Prime Minister, had become unflinchingly opposed to any deal with them. He had long been concerned about the American embassy close relations with Quavim, and he wanted to make sure that, if ever forced to choose, the Truman administration would not hesitate to pick the Shah over Quavim. Standing up to the Soviets was, he knew, a sure way to ensure American support. The Shah declared that he considered it unthinkable to allow Soviet technicians to wander freely over northern provinces during 50-year life of the proposed agreement. Quavim quickly realized the seriousness of the Shah's opposition to the Soviet deal, and first tried to convince him that Iran should at least prepare a counterproposal. The Shah objected, suggesting that the Soviets were so eager to get a toe in the door that they would in fact agree to any deal, no matter how favorable to Iran. Quavim then tried to frighten the Shah into submission by telling him that failure to grant some kind of concession to the Soviets might well beget their full attack on Iran, and that Americans have been unwilling to give any categorical assurances of prompt and effective support in case such an attack took place. But this too failed to change the Shah's mind. The Shah had ties of his own to the American embassy and figured rightly, as it turned out, that the Truman administration would not abide, losing Iran to the communists. The question of a possible Soviet attack was, of course, not just a Quavim ploy. With the Shah and members of the parliament increasingly hardening their position against Quavim's proposed concessions, the Soviet Union began to move its troops on the Iranian border, intimating the possibility of an attack on at least parts of Iran. Instead of withdrawing their forces from Azerbaijan, the Soviets began reinforcing them, particularly by pouring offensive mechanized units into Iran. The Soviets even made an official threat by declaring that it would be very dangerous for Iran if Russia did not get the concession she sought. The Shah and the U.S. Embassy in Iran grew concerned that these Soviet threats might not be a mere bluff or bluster. On March 4th, 1946, the American consul in Tabriz sent an urgent cable reporting ominous Russian troop movements. Some 500 trucks, leaded with ammunitions and supplies, and 20 tanks were being deployed in the direction of Tehran. A few days later, the American ambassador warned the Shah that Russians might occupy Tehran, an authority no less informed about the Soviet intentions than George Kennan, the chief architect of America's containment policy, concluded that it was a foregone conclusion that Soviets must make some effort in immediate future to bring into power in Iran a regime prepared to accede to major Soviet demands. While in Moscow, as America's chargé d'affaires, he had followed developments in Iran closely. According to Kennan, the future success of the containment policy and the West's ability to manage the Soviet threat were predicted on the cohesion and rigor it could muster against the USSR in Iran. Based on these warnings, the American embassy in Tehran began to prepare several contingency plans for just such an attack. In the midst of this dire planning, in June 1946, the Shah received a surprising communication from the Russian embassy inviting him to a special dinner party. The Soviet ambassador, Ivan Sadchikov, the Soviet ambassador, Ivan Sadchikov, insisted that it would create a very favorable impression on Soviet circle of HM, would accept the invitation. Lest the Shah had somehow missed the full implication of the invitation, the ambassador added that accepting such an invitation would be a serious blow for the Tudeh party. The target of the invitation was as much the Tudeh party as Kavam. The Soviets were willing to make a deal with anyone to get the concession they so coveted, and if Kavam was unable to steal the deal, they were ready to sacrifice him or even their comrades in the Tudeh party to make the deal with the Shah. The Shah demurred, suggesting that it would be more proper if the king invited the ambassador to the court for tea. While the Shah refused to conspire with the Soviets against Kavam, he had no qualms about meeting secretly with politicians opposed to Kavam and encouraging them to act against him. At the same time, the Shah began offering covert financial help to some royalist political parties. Of these, the most unusual was Sumka Party, led by a scholar named David Monchy-Azadeh, who modeled his looks and ideology, as well as his title as Rabar, on Hitler. The Shah, according to one source, even helped buy a house as the party's headquarters. By then, the Shah was also taking an active role in monitoring the activities of opposition parties, particularly the Tudeh party. Probably unbeknownst to the Shah, in late 1945, leaders of the party had contemplated the idea of seizing power in Iran and inviting the Soviet Union to join in their plans, which would have made Iran the first instance of a kind of people's republics that soon came to dot the map of Eastern Europe. Tudeh party leaders had at the time prepared a document called Political Conditions in Iran and Measures on the Development of Democratic Movement. It referred to the frequent change of governments in Iran as the sign that the ruling classes were incapable of solving Iran's problems. The party leaders recommended a democratic coup against the Shah and his family, who, in their words, were at the center of intrigues. The party claimed to have 1,000 members in Meshed, the capital of the province of Khorasan, and 6,000 in Tehran, all ready to participate in the coup. In an early reference to their clandestine network of military officers that was discovered some years later, the document added that Tuda supporter pilots would bomb the buildings of Majlis and army. By then, the Truman administration had made it abundantly clear to Stalin that Iran was in the West's sphere of influence, and that Soviet adventurism there would not be tolerated. At Yalta and at Potsdam, the two big powers' spheres of influence had been discussed. Stalin even walked into one meeting with a small note on which he had jotted down the countries he considered in his sphere of influence. He allowed Churchill to keep the note as a souvenir, while keeping the countries written on the note himself. The Tudeh Party plan for a democratic coup ran counter to these spheres of influence, and was rejected by the Soviet Big Brother. The Shah was, of course, never oblivious to the danger posed by the Tudeh Party. During this period, Colonel Hassan Pakravan was in charge of the section of the Army Intelligence Unit. Rockne Du, entrusted with the task of fighting communists, Pakravan reported directly to the Shah, who one day ordered him to find a reliable officer for a highly sensitive job. But then tensions over turf had already developed between the police and the army intelligence, particularly on the question of who should have the lead role in fighting communists. More than once, these battles allowed the Tudeh Party to escape detection. Pakravan chose his close friend and colleague, Lieutenant Hassanali Alavikia. Both Pakravan and Alavikia would go on to play important roles in the life of the Shah and his secretary organization, Sevik. The Shah ordered Alavikia to meet once a week at an already set time and place, Tuesdays at 2 in the corner of Said Ali Avenue. With a man who would report on the activities of the Tudeh Party leadership. It was a sign of the treacherous nature of Iranian politics in those years that the mole was allegedly introduced to the Shah by Mozaffar Baghai, a man of myriad talents and as many mysteries, who was considered in those years a fierce foe of the Shah and who continued to play a peripheral role in the Shah's political life for the next quarter century. According to Alavikia, the mole often provided first-hand knowledge of the most sensitive decisions of the party. His reports would be directly conveyed to the Shah. In fact, the Tudeh Party machinations, their alliance with Qavam, evident most clearly in the fact that at one time 3 of their leaders were giving material portfolios in Qavam's cabinet. The continued crisis in Azerbaijan. Qavam's increasing power and arrogance, and finally, signs that he harbored plans for overthrowing the monarchy and establish a republic. Russian model, perhaps, in its place. All combined to make the Shah particularly despondent in those months. His trepidation only increased when in February 1946, Kavam and the entourage of advisors, translators, and ministers left Tehran for Moscow, where they met with Soviet officials. The night before the group's departure, Kavam took them to the court and introduced them to the Shah. But in reality, he made every effort to keep the Shah marginal to his negotiations, not just with the Soviets, but with the American and British embassies. More than once, he confided in the American or British embassy and asked them to keep the Shah in the dark about it. In Moscow, Kavam met twice with Stalin. Tehran was rife with rumors that Kavam had made a secret deal with the Russians to overthrow the Shah. The British embassy at the time reported that Kavam might yield to Soviet pressure and become the president for a democratic front. Shortly after arriving back in Tehran, Kavam went to the court to report on the trip to the Shah. If the intent of the meeting was to dispel any anxieties the Shah might have had about what deal Kavam made with Stalin, it failed. The Shah tried to fend off Kavam's plans in several ways. Eventually, the Shah decided to warn Kavam directly about his ambitions. It was a measure of the two men's estrangement that when the Shah decided to warn his prime minister about the dangers of flirting with the Soviet Union, he needed the help of the American ambassador. Through the ambassador, the Shah told Kavam that if the Soviets had promised to install him in high office, they would do so, but that once they had squeezed him dry, they would toss him aside. In fact, the day before the Shah's plea, the American ambassador had, on his own, warned Kavam about rumors from Moscow, to the effect that he might be tempted towards disloyalty. Kavam denied the charges, but the ambassador remained convinced that Kavam had not told full story of Moscow plan. So worried was the Shah about the Soviet threat and about Kavam's conspiracies that for a while he reduced the number of his public appearances. His mood grew increasingly despondent. In a June 1946 meeting with the British Embassy, the Shah was obviously wary about his future and articulated defeatist ideas about the end of all regimes of constitutional monarchy. He predicted that neither the King of Greece nor Juan Carlos of Spain have an outside sporting chance of staging a comeback. On another occasion, he complained that Kavam had hired goons to physically assault him and the royal family. The British warned the Shah about his failure to appear in public, suggesting that people were beginning to think that he may be afraid. The Shah looked unhappy, discouraged, and the very frightened, even less sure of himself than usual. He often repeated what was becoming a mantra. It was, he said, impossible to be a constitutional ruler in Iran. The answer he received was less than satisfactory. A dictatorship was also impossible. He was told by the British ambassador. When reporting this conversation, the ambassador went on to make a comment on the Shah's character. The Shah, he said, was most inclined towards running away morally, if not even physically, from any problem.